Welcome to our webinar, Cuba, the International Response to the Humanitarian Crisis, presented in partnership between the Canadian Council for the Americas and Chatham House. Today's distinguished panelists include Tamar Miguel García, Deputy Director General for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Spain; Matthew Levin, former Canadian Ambassador to Colombia, Cuba, and Spain; Carlos Heredia, Associate Professor at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics in Mexico City, as well as a columnist at El Universal; and Katrin Hansing, Associate Professor at Baruch College, City University of New York. Today's conversation will be moderated by Kenneth Frankel, President of the Canadian Council for the Americas, and Chris Sabatini, Senior Research Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House in the UK. With that, we'll hand it over to Chris to begin the conversation.
And thank you, Marta, and thank you, all panelists. We're going to run this as sort of more of a discussion. So Ken and I will be bouncing questions around to the panelists. I want to say this is part of a larger effort that we're doing in Chatham House here, is trying to find ways in which, if you will, middle powers, some countries hate that term, but Canada, the EU, the UK, and others can begin to have a larger diplomatic role in Latin America. So with this, Katrin, let me start with you. We're going to talk first about the humanitarian conditions as they are right now, and then shift to sort of diplomatic, perhaps exit ramps or whatever, and what people are considering. Katrin, you've studied this for your whole life, basically. What is the humanitarian situation right now? And if you dare to project, should it continue at this rate, what could happen in 6 months or a year?
Right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for including me in this important conversation. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as was just mentioned, I just got back from Havana a few days ago. I was only there for a short period of time, but spoke to dozens of people, and I think got a pretty good sense of how things have changed and gotten worse since I lived there until last summer. So my comments are really, I hope, going to give you a sense of what's happening now, but also a bit of context, because this humanitarian crisis that everybody's kind of talking about as if it was potentially going to happen, as if it's sort of looming on the horizon. The fact is that it has been going on for a couple of years already. Cuba is already in a humanitarian crisis. And what could happen could be, frankly, a tsunami. So what I want to quickly just do with my comments is set the scene for you to give you a sense of what's going on now and how this has built up over the last few years. I mean, as we speak now, as all of you I'm sure know, no oil has been coming into Cuba since December. Reserves are running low. Public life has come to practically a standstill. There's very little traffic on the streets except a few Chinese electrical cars and motorcycles and a few diplomats who still have some reserves. People are staying at home. Only essential workers are going to work. Universities have been closed. Schools have altered schedules. It's very hard for the government to get the doctors to hospitals. Obviously, the blackouts continue to be pretty dire, particularly in the provinces that have been living with blackouts for years. That means 2, maybe 3 hours of electricity a day. In Havana, it's a bit better. All of this has massive consequences for daily life. What this means is that basically people's lives center around the few hours of electricity they have to be able to cook, to be able to wash, to be able to do, the basics. And that has really hijacked people's life for years now. But the reality on the ground is that and these are conservative figures, 40% of the population already lives in extreme poverty. There is malnourishment. There are large sections of the population, particularly elderly and children, who have been living on one meal a day, vitamins are low, protein intake is low. etc. But beyond that, as I'm sure many of you know, over not just the last 5 years, but decades since the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba's infrastructure and social system has been deteriorating. So healthcare, education, basics like roads, buildings have been literally falling apart. And this has now hit kind of rock bottom. So if we now look forward into the sort of short-term situation, if no oil comes in, and we don't know how much oil revenue there still is in Cuba, so there is a kind of a time bomb ticking. If no new oil comes in, this situation that I just described will get far worse, and people will literally be left in the dark. If that happens, this will have a huge consequence, not only on electricity, but also water, because most of the water in Cuba is pumped through the canals and onto people's roofs. Without electricity, that's not possible. Food production, dissemination, storage will be impossible. Getting to a hospital will be impossible. Even if aid comes in, which already there's some aid coming in from Mexico, from Chile, Spain, etc., how is this aid going to be disseminated if there is no oil? All of these questions are looming on the horizon. So the situation, I just want to repeat, is already very, very dramatic, but could get much, much worse in a very short period of time. And the million-dollar question, which nobody really knows, is how much time do we have? I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Scary, but excellent. And the question is how much time? Tamar, I know Spain has been assisting as it can. Give us a sense of your analysis and your government's analysis on the situation and what can be done, if anything.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. I couldn't express it better than Katrin actually has, especially because she's right back from Cuba, and we are absolutely concerned about the situation. And she's right to point out that this supposedly a humanitarian crisis looming is been there for years, even more for in the past, let's say 6-8 months, we have perceived that the situation has worsened dramatically as well. And now, yes, a few weeks ago, the executive order has put some additional pressure, but the oil and fuel problems and supplies was already critical in Cuba. So yes, we have been following this situation for years, for months, and we see that it's getting worse and worse. Maybe now we are about to experience definitely a burst somehow, but we don't know if and when. And in addition to what Katrin explained so well, it's important to point out the health crisis. We have been following the problems caused by the presence of garbage on the streets and the lack of supplies in hospitals. And right now, the problems of endemic diseases has been a bit better for the past couple of months because it's been the end of the rainy season. But the cases of dengue and chikungunya are expected to resurface in May with the rains, and it will meet the situation or a potential situation of even more scarce, let's say, medicines or health attention at that moment. So we think that in 2-3 months, if this situation continues as it is today, it could be absolutely critical from the health point of view. And apart from that, our analysis is very much similar to that of Katrin.
Thank you. I want to get back later to what can be done, but Ken, I want to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar and Katrin. precisely as Chris says, let's talk a little bit about what some of the countries might be thinking of doing, and what the countries who have had a relationship with Cuba up to the present, never cut off relations with Cuba. So before we get into actually what they think they could do, maybe if each of you could talk a little bit briefly about what the past is of your respective countries in humanitarian engagement with Cuba, even political engagement. I'll start with you, Matthew, because I always think the case of Canada is interesting. I think people don't quite understand exactly what it is. They think because Trudeau father was close to Fidel Castro, that Canada has always had a very, very close a very close relationship with Cuba. And perhaps you could talk just a little bit about what that relationship has been and where you think it is at the moment.
Thanks, Ken. And I also would like to thank Chatham House and Canadian Council Americas for organizing, I think, a really timely and important discussion on a crisis that, as Katrin has said, has been developing for a long time. But somehow, we've all kind of, those of us who are concerned about Cuba and the Cuban people, taking some comfort in this, what seemed to be almost an inexhaustible ability of Cuban people to, as the Cubans say, resolver, find a way out of what seemed to be intractable situations. But, you really have to wonder in the current circumstance whether that capacity is being exhausted. It's like I say, it's really a pleasure and honor to be joining Katrin and Carlos. I think, Katrin, your overview of the situation was certainly distressing, I think, for those people. But it's not surprising, as you say. This has been, in a way, developing for a very long time, and in a more acute phase. Certainly since COVID, it's become more. I think your description really gives a sense of how urgent and distressing it is. In terms of Canada's relationship with Cuba, or the current government and government structure in Cuba, anyway, and we won't go too far back, but there are highlights. Beginning with the decision at the time of the revolution to maintain normal diplomatic relations and normal trade relations with Cuba, despite the position, of course, of our closest partner and ally, the United States, and despite the pressure that was exerted at that time. I think Canada and Mexico were the only two countries in the hemisphere that maintained diplomatic relations with Cuba. Others, pressure, I think, largely by the United States, and some for their own reasons broke off ties with the new government. But that, I think, that gets a little bit implying, Ken, about there has been a relationship with a special quality, but within limits. I mean, at the time, our prime minister was the motivations for maintaining diplomatic relations were trade interests to some extent, which were not enormous, but which were real, and partly a sense of Canada's own independence internationally and not to be dictated to our own foreign policy choices. I think those were important considerations for the government at the time, and talking about 1959, 1960. But certainly the prime minister who made that decision, Diefenbaker, had a particular affection for the ideology of the new Cuban government. And in fact, not to recount too many historical anecdotes, but Castro came to Canada shortly after, I think it was 1960. And, our prime minister then, Diefenbaker, despite having insisted that Canada maintain a relationship with Cuba, didn't meet with Castro because of his own let's say, his uncertainty about what the regime was and his own misgivings about communism. And that's really been a hallmark to some extent, this, normal and even friendly relations, but circumspect, because they've been, they've been based on awareness on Canada's part, but also on Cuba's, that were, ideologically, in terms of political values and Pierre Trudeau, that certainly was a high watermark in the relationship. And that really, elevated to a different degree because not only because of Trudeau's decision to visit in 1976, so the first visit of a major Western leader to post-revolutionary Cuba, but the personal friendship between Pierre Trudeau and Fidel Castro, and of course, in a governance structure like Cuba, where Fidel really represented everything, I think the relationship between leaders meant that all kinds of engagement were possible, and a lot of high-level engagement took place. And then there were other moments, special period where there was a wave of new Canadian investment, made Canada one of the largest foreign investors in Cuba. So it's a relationship that's combined real engagement, real ties, real mutual benefits, and a normal and at times friendly political relationship, but really also circumspect because of the differences in the.
Matthew, if I could interrupt for 1 second. I guess the question, I think the history is important. Thank you. I guess the question is, where is the relationship now, today, and how do you think that affects Canada's ability to maneuver and desirability to maneuver and do something in Cuba?
Well, there are people better placed than I in the government. I've been in the government for years. My impression, certainly during my time, 2010, 2013, we continued to have the normal sort of relationship. I wouldn't call it a warm relationship in that period. It was correct. Our Prime Minister then, Prime Minister Harper, was not particularly keen on the government in Cuba. He recognized it was important to Canadians. He recognized we had interest there. He recognized it mattered. Latin America was important for him, and he recognized that Cuba mattered for many Latin American countries. So certainly nothing was done to really derail our engagement. But I think, the kind of certain degree of circumspection on both parties was perhaps more intense. Then I think the government under Trudeau, naturally, there was a certain tendency to rewarm the relationship, given the past, given, Justin Trudeau's father's relationship. But my sense is that, it hasn't returned to the degree of warmth and sort of substantial engagement we had between the 1970s and the 1990s. One of the key elements of the relationship has been tourism. Of course, tourism continued to grow right through the 2010s, the mid, and until COVID was a very significant part of the relationship and a very important part for Cuba particularly. And it also kind of was part of the people-to-people relationship, which is one of the most crucial aspects in the relationship. And really, I think it's the feelings, the warmth of feelings between many Canadians and Cubans that have also been kind of signals to the government about the importance of maintaining the relationship. But my sense generally, Ken, is that it doesn't have the degree of interconnectivity, the degree of mutual commitment that it has had at its peak periods.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Carlos, how about the case of Mexico?
Well, just let me just thank Ken and Chris for the invite to this conversation. Let me start by saying that Mexico has always wanted to be a third party in the U.S.-Cuba conflict, and it has played to different extents at different times that role. You know that Mexico has the special quality of being the only Latin American country that has uninterrupted relations with Cuba all along these years, for the 67 years. And over the last few years, as the situation deteriorated in Cuba, Mexico increased its shipments of oil, of food, and imported doctors from Cuba, several hundreds of doctors every year, which provided the regime with cash because all along, except for the last few months, the payment went directly to the Cuban state, to the government, rather than to the physicians, to the doctors. But I have to emphasize the fact that it has been a marriage of convenience because all along at that time, Cuba, opposite to what they were doing with other countries, did not engage in solidarity with the Mexican left. In fact, when Carlos Salinas de Gortari stole the 1988 election from Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the Cuban regime aligned with Salinas immediately because it was the PRI who had the strength to manage the relation, the bilateral relation. And so it has been a marriage of convenience in that regard. What's the situation right now? Well, President Sheinbaum has cut the oil shipments to Cuba only in the last few weeks under pressure from Washington, and has continued in the shipment of humanitarian aid with the big question up in the air of who is the final receiver of that aid and how it is transported all the way to its destination. But Mexico wants to play a third-party role in the situation right now, although it is not clear. Picking up on Prime Minister Carney's phrase at Davos, who will be at the table, who is at the table, and what's on the menu, or who is on the menu, because I doubt that there can be much of a conversation beyond the fact that Washington has only one item on the agenda, which is regime change. And the Mexican government has been, engaging in conversations about reform in Cuba. I'm afraid it's a bit late to discuss whatever kind of reforms falling short of regime change. That's the impression that I have. In fact, there was a delegation of Mexican academics a few weeks, most of them sympathetic to the regime in Cuba, but some critics. But the conclusion of the delegation was all the Cubans, the Castristas, the pro-regime, the anti-regime, all the Cubans want to talk to Marco Rubio. In a funny situation in which Rubio would allegedly play the role of a go-between with Trump. That Rubio would intercede for the Cubans vis-a-vis Trump because he has Cuban roots, as if Rubio were to have a different position than Trump's in the whole crisis, which I'm afraid is not the case, but that's how they saw it. So Mexico all along has wanted and has played a third-party role, but I'm afraid that more than a mediator, Mexico has been a facilitator. I think there have been direct contacts between Washington and Havana all along. There's this book that you all know, Back Channel, by William Leo Grande, and they describe in very meticulous detail how the back channel negotiations have been going on all along, and it is the case now. I would just name two outstanding features in these back channel contacts. One, that it's not necessarily Cuban government officials who are speaking on behalf of the Cuban side, but it's Castro family members. So it's Alejandro Castro Espín, and it's Raúl Guillermo Rodríguez Castro and Oscar Pérez Oliva, all members of the family. Grandchildren or sobrinos, nietos, all linked to the family. So that's one outstanding feature. And the other thing is precisely what the agenda is, and the agenda doesn't seem to budge from regime change. So the question up in the air, and I'm not predicting that it will happen. I'm just mentioning what's the buzz. Who is the Cuban Delcy Rodriguez? Again, I'm not implying that there will be one, but the sense is that the regime is not in a position to really negotiate the agenda, but to endure what Washington has decided the agenda will be. Of course, again, the Cuban regime is not the Chavez Maduro regime. It's very different. Politically, it's very different. We're talking about two different situations. But the sense is that the collapse is here. Not only the humanitarian crisis that I agree with Katrin and Matthew and Tamar that the humanitarian crisis has been there all along. It just has deepened and become even more serious and complex. But that the collapse, the political collapse of the regime, at least when you talk to Cubans, ordinary Cubans, and even Cubans who belong to the Communist Party, they say the collapse is here. We don't need to talk about a collapse that will come because it's already here. So what else can Mexico do? I don't have a very precise answer, just to have a sense of the reality, not of the regime, but of the Cuban society and the Cuban population as a whole. Because I think that any efforts to bail the regime out will fail if they do not address the everyday situation of the Cuban people. So who is Mexico aiding, the regime or the Cuban people?
May I ask a follow-up question to everyone here, which is, I think, clearly the U.S.-Cuban relationship dominates the situation right now, as it has basically since 1959. But given the depth of the crisis and the uncertainty and the likely unintended consequences, should it drag on, of massive outflow of balseros coming to the United States, which is obviously not in Trump's MAGA interests, and it's not in any humanitarian interests either. Is there a role? Is there a space so that no one is just waiting to see how this Rubio, if you will, Raulito, Cangrejo discussion goes on, to forge some sort of something that's not just a binary issue, regime change or collapse, but is actually, because let's be honest, humanitarian assistance is only a Band-Aid. As necessary as it is there a role for the international community to provide both using that humanitarian assistance so doesn't necessarily help the regime, but helps Cuban people, but also in terms of looking for some form of off-ramp that doesn't find, if you will, to use your analogy, Carlos, the next Delcy Rodriguez, who actually would probably be in the military, I'd assume in this case. Is there any potential on this? And I'll leave it open. Whoever wants to take this question generally. Well, it's a free-for-all. Anyone want to take this first? Okay, Carlos, we'll start with you. And then we'll go to Tamar. Carlos first, then Tamar. Go ahead.
Well, there have been talks of a joint effort by Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to talk to Washington and to Havana to try and open up the space that I see as non-existent now.
Yeah.
You have to pry open the whole situation to carve a niche that has to start with humanitarian aid, which is only a Band-Aid, as Chris has said, and to open up the political space so that Cubans from outside the island will also have a stake in the conversation.
Yeah.
I think that is a very important matter, and it's a widespread demand of Cubans everywhere. The Cuban community in Mexico City has insisted that they want to participate in the dialogue, and of course, let alone the Cuban diaspora in Miami and elsewhere in the United States or in Spain, which has grown to a significant extent. So how to open up the political space for a dialogue in which Cubans from different parts of the world can participate is basically the aim I see.
Good. Very good. Good point, Carlos. I hadn't thought about that, honestly. Tamar, what's your thoughts on this? You had a comment.
Okay, well, as you know, in Spain, we have very strong historic and cultural links with Cuba and also economic interests. At this moment, we have over 180,000 double nationals living in the island, plus all the diaspora there is in Spain, which has increased for the past few years very significantly. So as you can imagine, our interests, our political relations with Cuba have always been a priority for different governments all along. Right now, the situation, our political, let's say, links with Cuba are under the umbrella of the European Union. I suppose some of you know that we work under the political dialogue agreement of the European Union with Cuba. So our let's say communications or channel of communications go through this. But we of course also we have bilateral talks and contacts which are significant. Last week, Bruno Rodriguez, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Cuban Minister of Foreign Affairs, met with our Foreign Affairs Minister in the trip that took him first. I think it was to China, Vietnam, and then he came to Spain. Then he went to Russia, etc. And so our dialogue is continuous with the Cuban government. But we have always had a message for them that our support is mainly to the people of Cuba, not precisely to their government. And that's, in many ways, we have supported or condemned the embargo, the United States embargo in the United Nations, etc. So our position there is clear. But we have always, or very lately, very, very repeatedly passed the message that it's the time for them to start opening, to start making some changes, especially in economy. Some economic reforms have been announced by the government for months. They never happen. So for the past year, this situation, this economic situation, these cash flow problems have become more and more serious, and the announced reforms never come or are cosmetic somehow. So now we find ourselves in this situation, and the crisis is becoming more and more serious. So our message has always been that they need to take steps towards a change, right? And after that, we also have channels of communication with the United States. They have very clear that they want to have changes, to see changes in Cuba before the end of the year. We suppose they had the midterm elections in mind, and the thing in the agenda, as Carlos said, is a change, a political change. But I dare to say that the Americans also wouldn't mind starting by an economic change, some economic reforms. Which then, and of course, some gestures such as the freedom of political prisoners and some others. But the first step for them would probably be these economic reforms, followed by maybe a political agenda. We don't know on what grounds, how, or when, but we think their interest is basically in economic reforms, which they've got a point because they are much needed, and they were much needed. They have been much needed for many months or many years now. So this
I
is
want to give it
the
over to Katrin. What are your thoughts? I mean, you studied poverty and inequality in Cuba for decades now. What's your sense of what is necessary, those economic reforms, humanitarian assistance, and whether you think the Cuban government and the Cuban people would welcome some form of a compromise solution, if you will, a package of, and would it make any difference?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think that the most important change that needs to happen as soon as possible is economic liberalization on the island. The Cuban government really missed the boat 10 years ago during the Obama period to really, do that on a more wide scale basis. And then with the pandemic, everything kind of went downhill again. Now, Cuba has changed fundamentally in the last 5 years. It's lost 3 million of its population, mainly young, qualified professionals. So demographically, Cuba has changed a lot, and that really does have a huge consequence on many sectors of the society. But my sense is that, if change comes at a more paced rate, then the most important change that needs to happen as soon as possible, beyond the liberalization of political prisoners, is the economic opening of the island, open up more to the private sector and to international investment. Cuba has so much potential on so many levels. It could be, produce its own food. It could, be an amazing, not just tourist destination, but cultural tourism destination. There's so much potential for the island to flourish. And if that were to happen through an economic opening, within a decade or a decade and a half, I'm sure Cuba could be, on its right foot again. The question here is whether the government will do that. I am not as optimistic as some people because we have seen that the Cuban government, has had a very complex relationship to control. And I think, given the circumstances politically right now, it's sort of an all or nothing situation they find themselves in, particularly given the regime change attitude coming from the United States. The Cuban government has extremely bad cards at the moment, but given its long history of survival under very adverse conditions, it's been able to kind of just keep on going for a long time. And I just want to point that out because the situation on the ground is, as I explained earlier, already very, very difficult and could get much more dramatic. But it could get so much worse before the government sits down and negotiates seriously. And many of you know this, the Cuban government has a military kind of logic to it. It's lived under siege for so many years, or feels that it has. So to maneuver in this moment on their part is difficult, but not impossible. And I think the key thing here is they will want to buy more time. So if some oil comes in, then they will, buy a little bit more time. And if there is changes in the US in the midterm elections, then they'll buy more time. And so this is my concern as somebody who looks at the situation from below, works with people on the ground. This will have adverse effects on the population. People will die the more this drags out. So I want to just again remind us all that the humanitarian situation will probably get very, very bad very, very soon. And we need to think about not just how to support Cuba or Cuban people, as it were, on a humanitarian level, but how to get that aid into the island. Because as I said before, if there's no oil, how will shipments get to the people? I know that Caritas is very, very, working very hard all over the island through the Catholic Church. This is, in my opinion, probably one of the most important actors on the island and internationally, the Catholic Church. It has in the past always played an important role, as we know, also with the negotiations with Obama. But this is an angle I think we need to really think about, the role of the Catholic Church internationally, but also on the island, because it's the only institution beyond the Communist Party on the island that is represented all over the island, in every single village.
Thank you, Katrina.
Chris, could I? Oh, sorry,
yeah,
Ken.
go ahead, Matthew.
Sure.
Can I just jump in on Chris's question about space that, I think Carlos and Tamar commented very usefully on. If you look at it, there really isn't much space. It's not at all clear that the U.S. has really ever been interested in kind of engagement of third parties to promote something that was, more aligned with their interests. But the Cuban government also has not been. I mean, the Cuban government, it's kind of ironic that despite the hostile nature of the relationship, the United States has always been sort of the key interlocutor for Cuba. Among the many diplomatic missions, the largest by far is the U.S. interest section, I know, and has been for a long, long time. That's Cubans know that's a deal of some sort, a resolution to the nature of their constraints and problems has to be with the U.S. So neither party, I think, is really all that keen on others. The Cubans appreciate diplomatic support. So yes, certainly the annual, UN resolution condemning the embargo. The Cubans are delighted to have countries vote in favor. But when it comes down to the real nitty-gritty of engagement and working their way through this problem, I mean, they see the U.S. they have to deal with. Having said that, I don't think that means that countries like Canada, like those that Carlos has mentioned, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, of course, Spain, possibly other European countries. One could imagine there are others who might be, Norway has played an important role there at times. It couldn't marshal working together an interesting complement to whatever might happen in these next stages between the U.S. and Cuba. Because I think we'll see what the U.S. has in mind. People have talked about regime change, yes, but we've seen what happened in Venezuela. It's certainly well short of regime change. It's a kind of remanagement in a way that the U.S. can assert its interests. If they're looking at something like that in Cuba, you could imagine, and people have referred to there have been press reports about the U.S. and Guillermo Rodriguez Castro. If that's the model, you can see a deal being done with, that part of the regime, Gaesa, and it could be a deal that, as Mark says, has a lot to do with shifting economics on the island, opening up some sectors. But one can imagine it could fall far short of the kind of transition that would lead to a kind of pluralist, inclusive Cuba that I think most of us would like. It mean an abandonment of the values that have characterized Cuba in the last 60 years, but it certainly means a governance structure with those values can be pursued in a way that defends the dignity of Cuban people and quality of life of Cuban people. So, I think I hope there will be some discussion among that group of like-minded countries. We mentioned a few of them, there may be others, about how they could together, you mentioned before variable geometry, how they could together be a force to accompany whatever kind of discussions take place and eventually agreements might take place between current U.S. administration and the Cuban government to ensure that all those voices that are, the society is the voices are not heard and they're not influential, they don't influence policy, but they're present. They are articulated in different spaces. Carlos mentioned the diaspora communities, certainly. They're also present within Cuba. To marshal those voices, so they can have influence on the shape of this change that takes place. That may sound fairly idealistic, and perhaps it is. Perhaps it's illusory to think that's possible. But it seems to me it would be worth the effort for countries like my own, who are looking to, in coalitions that are variable according to the situation, but that nevertheless are seeking to defend certain principles of an international order that respect sovereignty, that put forward certain values about democratic values, but also, humanitarian values, values of people's right to have dignity and a decent life. If that could somehow, as a complement to whatever takes place between the US and Cuba, that would be worth exploring. And I hope governments will do that. Certainly it's not risk-free, and governments will manage this very carefully, given the preponderant interest they have in each of them in their relationships with the US. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that some, a shared initiative along those lines could not be developed in a way that's useful. That will require much more exploration and much more sort of making concrete what they might hope to achieve and how they might hope to proceed in that direction.
Thank you, Matthew. And cuenta con nosotros in planning some of that, or perhaps having a role, we hope. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I'm listening to both sides of my brain, perhaps. On one side, I hear, well, there may be ways that are changes that the Cuban government could undertake after conversations, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but that's not on one hand, and possible paths, who knows? And on the other hand, I'm listening to Katrin's talking about what's happening now and what could happen in 30 days from now, which seems to be operating on a very different time frame than conversations and developing coalitions to try and help. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe these things could come together overnight. It doesn't seem that to be the case. And so I guess the question I would have, and I guess it's in this case for Tamar and Carlos, it would seem that the unarticulated U.S. policy on this, or the de facto policy, is inflict as much humanitarian crisis or allow as much humanitarian crisis to go on as a means to regime change. I mean, I'm not sure I see it without some sort of indication otherwise. It seems to be that's the course that they're on. So I wonder, Tamar, in the conversations that you've had, I think you mentioned you're in conversations with the U.S. government. Is there a sense that there's no bottom to how much humanitarian pain will be tolerated until there is concrete evidence that there will be many steps or whatever positive steps taken forward in the view of the United States to change, the government in Cuba?
I don't know if I would put it like that. But one thing that's for sure is that they have expressed that their priority is a change in the island, and that the situation the people are dealing with has been there for decades, and they don't feel responsible for this. So it's a way of, turning the focus from the humanitarian situation to their objectives, let's say. And it's something interesting to mention is what we have experienced is that how different the perspectives are from one side and the other. Because on the one side, we have the Americans who don't feel responsible at all for the problems the island is going through. And therefore, this humanitarian crisis would not be their main, let's say, concern. I mean, this is a bit drastic, maybe, but in a way, their focus is not attending the needs of the people at this point. Then, if you talk to the Cubans, you realize how they somehow rely or rely on the resilience of their people and the capacity they have to support, or to not support, to endure hardship for decades, and to invent, let's say, or to find out ways to live every day in this situation. So sometimes when you talk to both parties, you think they are describing a different reality. They are so far apart. So yes, it's I mean, sometimes we have the impression that the situation people are enduring is not the priority of one part nor the other, and this is of course really concerning on our side.
Could I just
you.
jump in here for a second and add a perspective that I think might be interesting to you and the audience? Is that I completely agree with what Tamar just said. It's sort of like the Cuban people are just sort of are caught once again in the middle of these two governments. But last week when I was there, I asked a lot of different people about how they, what they wish for in this sort of short to medium term. And I was not necessarily surprised, but it was quite new for me to hear, particularly young people who have been born after the special period, i.e., since the 1990s, vocalize a very clear desire for immediate change at any price, including, if need be, a military invasion on the part of the US. I had never heard that so widespread and so bluntly, whilst sort of the next generation, people, who were raised during the revolution in the 1980s, were much more nuanced. They too were very clear about, yes, we want change. We're exhausted living in this reality. This is not going anywhere, but not change at any price. So there is a much more strong value of sovereignty and national independence still alive. And I think this is very interesting to remember in terms of people's own wants. I think there are very few people left on the island who wouldn't agree that change, both economic and political, is necessary. But the younger generations who don't remember living inequality in Cuba in the 1980s or 70s have no more patience. And I think this is very interesting also in terms of potentially the future of Cuba. And the same exact model is reflected in the Cuban diaspora, this polarization according to generations. It's very, very interesting. And I think we need to keep that in mind as well when we think about Cuba's future.
So Chris, let me just bring in, Carlos, I was going to ask you, is that, I listened carefully to what everybody has said, and particularly Tamar's thing. It would seem to me that an argument could be made that the government and I suppose the U.S., if we want to say, is basically using the humanitarian. I mean, the Cuban people are just pawns in all of this. Basically, no side really has solving this humanitarian crisis at its heart. So I mean, there's plenty of recrimination to go around on this, I suppose. What's your view? And of course, whatever else you wanted to add, you had your hand up anyway.
Yeah. Well,
and thanks for your patience. Thank you.
Yeah, well, now listening to the last few remarks, I go back to the top question, which is how to increase the negotiating strength of the Cubans in Cuba. Because the Cuban government may be willing to talk to Washington or Mexico City or Lula or whoever, but what happens to the Cubans in Cuba? How do we increase their negotiating strength? And what Katrin just said is very true. It resonates with what I've heard. And it resonated with Venezuelans who said, let the Americans invade because we want Maduro gone at whichever price and without knowing what comes next. I bet they didn't imagine what Delcy came next. But in any event, the sense of exhaustion is there, the sense of being absolutely fed up. So if there is some sense in the work being done outside of Cuba, is how to increase the negotiating strength of Cubans in Cuba. That's my sense. And the pressure on the regime can endure the pressure. It's the people that cannot endure the absolute failure of the regime to provide them with basic, satisfactors to their needs, from liberty to food. So that's the bottom line for me. How do we increase the negotiating strength of Cubans in Cuba?
Thank you all. I'm sorry, I need to go. This was only planned for an hour. I'll let Ken wrap it up, but I think there's a lot that can be done here. And I don't want to enlist anyone who's on the panel, or God forbid, who just signed up for this discussion and now are participating. But I think there's a lot of discussion here, and I hope we can continue these discussions and even play a role. I'm going to sign off. Ken, Marta, Katrin, always great to see you. Carlos, Tamar, thank you all for joining. Matthew, and we will be in touch.